Cullinane has indicated to speak. We've said we'll give a maximum of an hour if it takes an hour or whatever. So at this stage, we'll do 5-minute slots because there's quite a few who want to get it. So 5-minute slots, and we'll stick to that. Thank you. Deputy Cullinane, Deputy MacDonald, Deputy Murphy, Deputy Connolly. That sequence, we have a note of that now.
Can I welcome Mr. O'Brien and Ms. Colley? On page 3 of your opening statement, Mr. O'Brien, there's an important paragraph which is a response that you read into the record of this committee that came from the Light itself, which says that it was not in our terms of reference to conclude as to whether the shortfall in the funding for Grace was effectively an additional cut in funding to the body or deliberately done because of the whistleblowing. This is a matter for the Commission of Investigation. So I am assuming that you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
Yes, so whether or not the organisation was treated fairly or unfairly in terms of its funding will be something that the Commission of Investigation will examine as part of its work?
Correct.
Okay, and when we go to the cover letter, we can get that up on the screen, that you, the date dated 26th of September 2017. This is where you wrote to the clerk of the committee and attached a copy of the report. You say, consequently, the service provider was not treated either unfairly or disproportionately when compared to other similar funded organisations. That's your opinion, Mr. O'Brien. It is not the opinion of the Light. So how can you determine whether or not they were treated fairly or disproportionately or proportionately if, in fact, that was something that the Light was not asked to consider? That's something for the Commission of Investigation to determine. So can you please first of all explain to this committee how you can put in writing to us your view and your contention that they were not treated unfairly? And bear in mind, the last time you were here on this issue, Mr. O'Brien, you hung the opportunity of an apology to the service providers on whether or not they were treated fairly or unfairly, and you said that we will see what's in the Deloitte report. But Deloitte was never in a position to determine whether they were treated fairly or unfairly. So I think maybe you should correct the record of the committee and confirm that actually only the Commission of Investigation will determine that, and that maybe will determine whether they get an apology. But anyway, my question is, how were you able to put in writing to this committee that, in your view, they were treated fairly and proportionately, as opposed to unfairly and disproportionately?
Sure, those are certainly the alternatives. The reason I gave you my opinion was because the former chairman asked me to revert to this committee on that matter. The question asked at the end of that meeting in February 2016 was quite clear. I am required to form an opinion, and the reason is this: if I formed an opinion that in the interim period or in any arrangements made since, the service provider was treated unfairly or was being treated unfairly, I would have an obligation to do something about it, notwithstanding the subsequent determinations that the Commission of Inquiry will make. So I believe that as the accounting officer currently for the HSE, and with regard to the request made of me by the chairman of the former committee on the last day of that committee's actions, I have an obligation to form that opinion. I have formed that opinion, and I've shared it with the committee.
Can I say that that's slightly disingenuous with respect, because the letter that you penned to this committee is a letter that accompanies the Deloitte report, and the whole context of the letter is setting out what's in the Deloitte report. It talks about table 6.4, it talks about comparative analysis and so on, so it's a reference back to the Deloitte report. And then on the back of that you give your opinion, and it's your opinion that the service provider was not treated fairly or disproportionately. My point is that the Deloitte report was not in a position to make that determination. So what we can categorically say here today is that Deloitte, who produced this independent report, are clearly not saying that the service providers were treated fairly or unfairly because it wasn't within their remit. You have given your opinion, and that's your opinion based on what's in the Deloitte report, but it wasn't in the terms of reference for Deloitte. Would that be a fair analysis?
Yeah, but let me just step back, if I may. The chairman of the PAC at the time didn't ask me to commission an independent report. He asked me to have a look. I took the decision to have the assistance of an external reviewer as part of having a look. The responsibility to form an opinion on this at this stage, not prejudicing, not taking away from the role of the statutory commission, is mine. It was my decision to have Deloitte provide that information. It was this committee's decision to request that it would have the benefit of that report, which I've provided. in fulfilment of the request of the previous chairman, and as part of my statutory duties, I need to have an opinion. I have told you what it is. You're entitled to say that you don't agree with that opinion. The Commission of Inquiry is entitled to interrogate my opinion, but my opinion remains my opinion.
That's not the point I'm making at all, and you know that, Mr. O'Brien. My point is that Deloitte have not passed any comment on whether or not the service provider was treated fairly or unfairly.
One minute, Deputy.
And I think, with respect, Mr. O'Brien, you are, in my view, preempting the work of the Commission by being very clear in your view that they were not treated fairly. I just want to get to another question.
I respond to that briefly, and perhaps the Chairman will allow you a little more time so that I can do that. In my report, in my opening statement, I carry that very phrase that Deloitte were not tasked with that. I've reiterated that. It's in the record of my opening remark. None of this takes away from the fact that if I failed to offer an opinion, if I didn't come here with an opinion, I think you could reasonably hold that I was not doing my job today, which is to have a view as to whether that service provider needs restitution at this point.
What you told this committee in the past, Mr. O'Brien, is that you would form that view on the basis of a Deloitte report, which it now seems was not even asked that question and was outside their terms of reference, and there is still an investigation ongoing. That's my point. But if we get to another issue that is the key issue, which is the draft report that we haven't seen sight of, and the whistleblowers wrote to this committee and they're concerned that elements that were in the draft report did not make their way into the final report. You've given the view of the author of the report, and that's fine. And you say that, and they say that the table 3.3, which is referred to, was not removed at the behest of the HSE, but it was removed for other reasons, and it was the information was subsumed into a different table. The service providers have said to me that they were told by Deloitte that the only reason why that table was removed was because the HSE insisted on it being removed.
I've seen that in the correspondence. What I can do is provide to the clerk a copy of the letter that Deloitte provided to me at my request. I asked them to review what had been said in the letter that the committee provided from the service providers. Like you, I haven't seen the draft report. Like you, I didn't take part in any discussions with Deloitte about the draft report. I have inquired of Deloitte whether the allegations made are in accordance with their understanding and their decisions in relation to the content of the final report as distinct from the draft report. They've confirmed in writing that which I quoted in my opening statement. I have no other knowledge.
I make one final comment, because it is very difficult for us. I understand we only have the hour, and within 5 minutes it's almost impossible to be able to get to the bottom of this, because there's so many questions.
The other speakers will.
And they will, right, but just one final point. The difficulty is this, Mr. O'Brien. When you come before us as the accounting officer and you say, I didn't see sight of the draft, doesn't cut it for me because your organisation did. So the process here is that this report was commissioned by the HSE. It was at your behest, as you said. The terms of reference were set by the HSE. It was paid for by the HSE, and your staff interacted with the author of the report. So the toing and froing in terms of giving drafts and maybe correspondence was carried out by members of your organisation. So you had an obligation to find out what exactly was going on in terms of the communication between your staff and the author and why this table was removed. It's not good enough to simply say, I didn't see the draft, and that's okay then. You don't have to answer questions on it. You're the accounting officer. And I say that to tee up maybe other people, and they'll have their questions as well, but I don't think that's a satisfactory answer, Mr. O'Brien.
And then we're going to Deputy MacDonald. Final response to that question.
Whether any member likes these processes or not is really beside the point. If I commission an external party to carry out a review, the only thing I ever get from that external party is their final report. I have not seen it. At the committee's request, I asked Deloitte would they be prepared for that draft report to be provided to the committee, and they have indicated that if the committee requests that of them, they'll consider that request.
We just want on the record, you're satisfied for us to write directly to Deloitte to request a copy of the draft report? And you'll consent to it being issued because you were the client? Yes,
but the draft is Deloitte's property. I have no objection to them releasing it, but it's their decision.
So explain the difference then. I'm sorry, Deputy MacDonald. The draft is Deloitte's property. Whose property is the final report?
The HSE's.
So you own the final report, but they own the everything. They own the draft.
Yes.
Okay.
What you could give us, Mr. O'Brien, is I would imagine if there was correspondence or communication between the Light and your organisation, and maybe you might be able to tell us what staff members at what level were they engaging, because there was engagement between the HSE and the author of the report. So while it is up to the Light to give us a copy of a draft, you could provide us with copies of emails and correspondence that maybe went over and back, so we can then determine ourselves whether or not a request was made by the HSE to remove the table. That's the only way in which we will be able to determine whether or not what the service provider said to me, that the Light said to them, that the only reason why that table was removed is because the HSE insisted it be removed, and you're saying that's not the case. So how do I establish that?
We're moving on. So,
just for a number of quick questions. I know we're under time pressure.
Yeah.
Mr. O'Brien, and this is more first of all to yourself, Cathaoirleach, and I'll get to Mr. O'Brien then. I think it's unacceptable for this committee that we have an accounting officer that comes before the Public Accounts Committee, specifically invited in to respond to queries and concerns that outside people have and we have in respect of an earlier draft of a final report, and for the accounting officer to say, well, I didn't see the draft, and the people in the room then who did see the drafts and corresponded with the Light are possibly not in the room, which means then that we can't either put questions to Mr. O'Brien, in which case he can then confer to the people who were in correspondence. So my question, first of all, to Mr. O'Brien, that's just for future reference, because we have to do our job. Mr. O'Brien, the person or persons who were directly involved in liaising with the Light in terms of the drafts, who were they?
Ms. Colley was the principal person, but also there would have been a senior operations member from the social.
Ms. Colley, okay, were you then were you one of those in the organisation that had sight of the drafts?
Well, we all got drafts in May.
Not all, because Mr. O'Brien did not.
No, in terms of the stakeholders and the parties that had contributed to the report.
My question, Ms. Colley, is that were you one of the HSE representatives who engaged with the Light and had sight of the drafts that are being referred to?
Yes.
Yes. And can you then answer the question, because Mr. O'Brien is unable to answer the question, if the whistleblowers are saying and the service providers are saying that the HSE insisted that table 3.3 was removed, maybe you can answer that question then. Did you or any of your colleagues in any correspondence or in any exchanges with the author of the report either insist or ask that that table be removed?
Certainly not in my correspondence to Deloitte's, no.
No, okay. And Mr. O'Brien, to go back to the line where you say that consequently, and you're talking about consequent to the Deloitte report, the service providers were not treated unfairly or disproportionately, and then you go on to compare that to other similarly funded organisations. But Deloitte did not examine the funding of other organisations. And you acknowledged that €600,000 had to be paid retrospectively to this service provider for the care of Grace. How many other organisations would that have happened, that an amount of that scale would have been paid retrospectively?
First of all, this was paid as part of a settlement with the plaintiff.
I'm not talking about I'm talking about the amount. So there was an amount of 600,000 that was retrospectively paid to this organisation. So how many other organisations, similar organisations of that scale, received and provide similar services, received a figure anywhere near the scale of 600,000?
I'd have to check that for you.
Surely you would know as an accounting officer, Mr. O'Brien, with respect. Surely you would have some idea. Was there even one?
Well, you'll appreciate the size of the HSE, its diversity, how long it's been in existence, and its predecessors.
So you don't know at this point in time?
No.
So how then
that
can
was
you?
my first
no, sorry, with respect. So how then, if you don't know today, okay, you don't know today. So how then can you say that they were not treated unfairly or disproportionately compared to other similarly funded organisations when you have acknowledged that you had to pay a figure of 600,000 retrospectively? You've acknowledged that, but you can't give us one example of another organisation who received a similar back payment, and yet you then say they weren't treated unfairly. That just doesn't chime.
I'm looking at the prospective funding, the decisions that were made year on year for this organisation versus others. and an organisation that was being funded, it appears, at an appropriate level. And might I say, if I were to look at the statements by the directors of the service provider in their own annual financial statements, in this case related to the year ended 2013, they say the deterioration in results reflects the reduction in HSE funding, and in parenthesis they say, as a result of general cuts to the health service budget under the government's economic recovery programme and the temporary increase in staff costs which were not funded by the HSE. So they themselves acknowledge the context in which financial decisions were being made which affected them and other service providers. I suspect everyone who suffered those cuts would regard it as unfair. My examination was to determine whether they appeared to be applied in a reasonable and fair way across comparable organisations.
Thank you for that, Mr. Franklin. Put my final contribution to you, Cahir, because I don't think we're going to get any response from Mr. O'Brien which will satisfy me today. So can I just put this to you? The actual Deloitte report says that there was, I think it was a 6% cut rather than a 2% increase in the organisation's funding to service provider in 2010. When Mr. O'Brien and his colleagues were before the Public Accounts Committee in the past, they said it was a 2% cut. So in fact there was misinformation given to PAC before. But on that specific point in relation to whether or not they were treated fairly or disproportionately or unfairly, and you put questions as well, I think it's reasonable for us to assume, would you not, and I think we have to come back to this in some regards, that if €600,000, which is a big amount of money for a service provider at that scale, if that was paid retrospectively, and Mr. O'Brien is not in a position to name any other similar organisation which received a similar payment, is it reasonable then for us to determine that it's not fair then to say that they were treated fairly?
Okay,
I don't think that's a fair. I don't think any reasonable person would conclude that's a fair point for someone to make.
One will let the Commissioner is specifically looking at that specifically, and WIDA make that exact point. Secondly, we can pass on the information, but we can't come to a conclusion without us examining the funding of the other organisation to come to that conclusion, which we're not going to do.
But Mr. O'Brien has. My point is, Mr. O'Brien is categorical in saying that they were, based on the information that he has, they were not treated unfairly.
And that's the
but
point.
he's not able to give one example of any other organisation of a similar scale that received a retrospective back payment of a similar amount. And I think that's a problem.
And as you said through the chair, I agree. What we are now saying will be on the transcript and will be going to the Commission for them to draw the. We can't.
I understand that.
We can't disprove Mr. O'Brien's conclusion